Welcome to the Deep Dive, the place where we take the sources you've provided and perform a kind of intellectual alchemy, pulling out the gold nuggets of knowledge and insight you absolutely need. Today, we are undertaking, I think, a monumental deep dive into the life and mind of Clive Staples Lewis, a man known across the world really simply as Jack.
And Lewis is, you can make a very strong case, the single most successful intellectual synthesizer of the 20th century. I mean, born in 1898, passes away in 1963, and he built these parallel careers.
Right, at the same time.
Exactly. On one hand, he was this rigorous literary scholar holding tenured positions at both Oxford and Cambridge.
Which is incredible on its own.
It is, and yet simultaneously he's this imaginative genius who authors books that are just foundational to modern fantasy, and then on top of all that becomes one of the most influential Anglican lay theologians in history.
The breadth is just staggering. I mean, when we look at the snapshot of his work, we're talking about everything from the deep theological science fiction of the Space Trilogy to the whimsical yet deeply moral children's fantasy of the Chronicles of Narnia.
And you can't forget the piercing satirical fiction of the Screwtape Letters.
Or the straightforward, foundational Christian apologetics in Mere Christianity. He really wrote across every imaginable genre.
And that's our mission today. We want to provide you with a shortcut to understanding this complexity. We're going to unpack the sources you shared to see how Lewis's early life, his trauma, his deep-seated resistance, and then his eventual intellectual surrender, how all that shaped the literary imagination and the philosophical rigor required for those later contributions.
It's the story of the man who went from being a committed, even an angry atheist, to, in his own words, the most reluctant convert in all of England.
It's a fascinating journey.
Okay, let's unpack this and start at the beginning. The making of Jack. Lewis was born in Belfast in Ulster, Ireland in 1898, and the details we have about his parents really set the stage for his intensely intellectual but also emotionally guarded upbringing.
For sure. His father was Albert James Lewis, a solicitor, whose family had come over to Ireland from Wales a couple of generations earlier. But it's his mother, Florence Augusta Lewis Flora, who, really underscores the intellectual foundation of that home.
She sounds incredible. The sources highlight that she wasn't just well-read, she was a true pioneer for her generation. She was the first female mathematics graduate at Queen's College, Belfast.
Just think about that. For the late 19th century, that is an amazing achievement.
It really is.
And it speaks volumes about the value placed on intellectual discipline and logic in that household. Lewis absolutely inherited this, but the fascinating contrast between that formal upbringing and his intimate self, it really comes out in the story of his preferred name.
Which is, of course, Jack. Most people know him as C.S. Lewis, but everyone close to him, they all called him Jack. And their origin story is just heartbreakingly charming.
It is. When Lewis was just 4 years old, his beloved dog, Jaxie, was killed by a horse-drawn carriage. And in his grief, the young Clive Staples Lewis just adopted the dog's name. He insisted on answering to no other name.
He was that adamant about it.
Totally adamant. Eventually, it got shortened to Jack, and that just stuck for life among his friends and family.
It's such an early indicator of that internal intensity, that deep sense of loyalty and maybe emotional self-protection that would really characterize his whole life. And this emotional intensity was fostered by an environment that was just absolutely saturated with books.
The family home, Little Lee, was a veritable library. I mean, Lewis later wrote that finding something to read there was as easy as walking into a field and finding a new blade of grass.
What a great line.
It was an unlimited supply of literature, just fueling his early fascination with mythology and history and pure storytelling.
And he didn't just consume this world alone. With his older brother, Warren, who is known as Warnie, they co-created their own incredibly detailed fantasy world, which they called Boxen.
And Boxen wasn't just a game. It was a fully realized, populated, and governed territory, run entirely by anthropomorphic animals. This detailed early effort at world building with geography, history, specific characters, this is clearly the deep foundational groundwork for the Chronicles of Narnia decades later.
But despite this wonderful, sort of insulated intellectual world in Belfast, Lewis was shocked when he was sent across the sea to school in England. The sources really emphasize that he felt a deep, almost wrenching cultural shock.
He felt alienated almost immediately. He wrote, and I'm quoting here, "No Englishman will be able to understand my first impressions of England." He found the landscape oppressive and the language even more so. He claimed that the strange English accents with which I was surrounded seemed like the voices of demons.
Wow, voices of demons. He really hated it then.
Oh, he conceived initially a deep hatred for England, which took many years to heal.
Wait, what specifically made him feel such an affinity for Ireland that the move felt like such a betrayal?
It was really rooted in his love for the specific heritage and literature. He was a huge admirer of W.B. Yeats and the whole Celtic literary movement. He sustained this affinity by occasionally indulging in what the sources call a tongue-in-cheek chauvinism toward the flippancy and dullness of the Anglo-Saxon race.
So he was kind of joking, but also kind of not.
Exactly. He continued to seek out the company of other Irish expatriates and regularly referred to his visits home as returning to my Irish life.
That profound loyalty to his Irish, specifically his Ulster Protestant roots, is so vital for understanding his later theological project, isn't it? I mean, he saw the sectarian divisions all around him growing up.
That's a key point. Critics suggest that his dismay over the religious and political conflict in Belfast actually drove him to champion a deeply ecumenical form of Christianity. He wasn't interested in the battles between denominations.
No, his focus was always on finding the common ground.
And that's where the concept of mere Christianity comes from. He repeatedly extolled the virtues of all branches of the Christian faith, choosing to focus on the core doctrinal beliefs that every Christian tradition shares, and just rejecting the walls that separated them.
It sounds like an attempt to transcend the very divisions he witnessed in his homeland.
It was. But we do have to include that important caveat from the sources. One critic suggested that while the goal was unity, Lewis's mere Christianity may have masked many of the political prejudices of an old-fashioned Ulster Protestant.
What does that mean in practical terms? That his theology, while it was aimed at unity, might have implicitly retained some of his cultural biases?
Precisely. For an old-fashioned Ulster Protestant of that era, the idea of British withdrawal from Northern Ireland was, well, it was unthinkable. So the critique is that no theology exists in a vacuum. Lewis was trying to separate the eternal spiritual truths from messy human politics, but his particular cultural lens shaped what he saw as core and what he saw as peripheral.
That's a crucial nugget of nuance. Even a deeply committed apologist has blind spots rooted in their origins.
It's a powerful foundation.
Absolutely. So let's dig deeper into how Lewis's life moved from this bookish, culturally isolated childhood into the furnace of World War I. This transitions us perfectly into Section 2, war, academia, and the extraordinary journey of his reluctant conversion.
Well, the quiet, book-filled life changed dramatically when he won a scholarship to University College, Oxford in 1916. But before he could fully settle into academic life, the Great War just took hold of everything.
He entered Oxford in 1917, and his path forward was, well, pragmatic and brutally fast. He immediately joined the Officers' Training Corps because he saw it as the quickest route into the Army.
And within months of setting foot in Oxford, he was shipped to the French front.
On his 19th birthday, November 29, 1917, he arrived at the Somme Valley front line. Just think about that. 1 minute, he's reading Latin texts at an Oxford college. The next, he's experiencing the full industrial horror of trench warfare in the middle of winter.
And the sources detail the life-defining incident that really cemented his deep-seated pessimism. In April 1918, during the massive German Spring Offensive, Lewis was severely wounded.
But not by the enemy.
No. He was hit by friendly fire, a British shell falling short of its target.
And 2 of his colleagues were killed in that exact same incident.
The emotional and physical trauma was just profound. He was already reeling from the death of his mother when he was young, and now this experience of violence, compounded by the sheer absurdity of friendly fire. It solidified his youthful atheism. He later said that this event formed the absolute basis of his subsequent worldview, one of profound pessimism about God's design, if such a designer even existed.
That trauma, however, was quickly followed by this astounding intellectual comeback. He was demobilized in December 1918 and immediately returned to Oxford. What happened next is almost unbelievable in terms of academic speed and success.
The scholar in him just exploded. Lewis achieved what is almost unheard of in the Oxford system, a triple first.
Which means
It means the highest honors, first-class degrees, in 3 different fields: classics, philosophy and ancient history, and English. The sheer intellectual horsepower required for that is just staggering.
So he managed to channel that trauma and grief directly into academic rigor. By 1925, he was elected a fellow and tutor in English literature at Magdalen College. That set him up for 29 years of stability, but his personal life remained incredibly complex because of a wartime pact he had made.
Yes, the Janie Moore promise. During his Army training, he became very close friends with a fellow cadet, Paddy Moore. And they made this solemn, mutual pact. If either of them died in the war, The survivor would take care of the other's family.
And Patty Moore was killed in action in 1918. So Lewis, true to his word, honored that promise throughout his life. Patty had introduced Lewis to his mother, Janie King Moore, who was a woman 26 years Lewis's senior.
And Lewis moves in with Mrs. Moore and his brother Warney. They buy the house they called the Kilns together. He lived with and cared for Janie Moore until she was institutionalized and then passed away in 1951. He introduced her as his mother and provided everything for her, especially since his own relationship with his father was distant and quite troubled.
Now, this is the point where the sources introduce the speculation regarding the romantic nature of their relationship. This is often debated, isn't it?
It is. Lewis was extremely private, but the speculation really centered around the fact that Lewis lived in the same house as Mrs. Moore for 3 decades. George Sayer, a friend and biographer of Lewis, he initially stated the likelihood of them being lovers was 50-50.
Why only 50-50?
Well, he noted the oddity of Lewis referring to her as mother if their relationship was romantic, and the fact that they always maintained separate bedrooms.
But the sources indicate Sayer changed his mind, didn't he? What convinced him to update his biography later?
He consulted with Mrs. Moore's daughter, Maureen, and he actually examined the physical evidence, the layout of the bedrooms at the Kilns. In his revised introduction, Sayer wrote that he was quite certain that they were lovers, suggesting their relationship had been intimate despite the age difference and that public veneer of adopted kinship.
That's a pretty significant detail, grounding the speculation in physical evidence. However, other biographers, like Philip and Carol Zaleski, they maintained that the exact nature of the affair, or even if it started, remains unclear.
Right. But regardless of the sexual nature, the devotion was absolute, unwavering. He cared for her through her later years when she developed dementia, visiting her every single day in the nursing home. It was a commitment born from a wartime promise, reflecting a fierce, defining loyalty that superseded typical social norms.
And this deep loyalty was, for a long time, paired with a profound and intellectual atheism. Let's revisit that atheistic stance. He became an atheist at 15, and the sources describe his attitude toward God, or the lack of God, as being full of this paradoxical fury.
Absolutely. He described himself as paradoxically very angry with God for not existing and equally angry with him for creating a world. He was intellectually prepared to argue against any form of divine design.
And he used the heaviest intellectual ammunition available. He quoted the Roman poet Lucretius as providing one of the strongest arguments against God's design, which sums up the problem of evil with this brutal economy. What was the essence of that quote?
It was a simple rhetorical question. Had God designed the world, it would not be a world so frail and faulty as we see. I mean, if an all-powerful, all-loving God exists, why is the world so full of pain, suffering, and physical frailty? This was Lewis's fortress, the logical, evidence-based argument that misery precludes divine design.
So if he built such an intellectual fortress, what was the first crack? What led him away from that position, especially when he was surrounded by fellow atheists at Oxford?
It was literature, initially. He was deeply affected by the work of the Scottish writer George MacDonald, particularly his novel Phantastes. Lewis recorded that encountering MacDonald's writings was a pivotal moment. He felt it showed him a spiritual reality that resonated far deeper than his current philosophical materialist worldview.
He also cited G.K. Chesterton, correct? The author who blended wit and paradox and sharp theological defense.
Yes, Chesterton's The Everlasting Man was crucial because it presented Christianity not as some historical accident or a mythological relic, but as the only possible explanation that made coherent sense of human history and creativity.
But the final push, the one that turned him to theism, came from his Oxford colleagues, particularly the long walks and late-night arguments with J.R.R. Tolkien.
Lewis describes himself as fighting tooth and nail against what he saw as the encroaching truth. He records vigorously resisting the conversion, saying he was brought into Christianity like a prodigal, kicking, struggling, resentful, and darting his eyes in every direction for a chance to escape.
He saw it not as a joyous homecoming, but as an intellectual defeat.
That's it, exactly. And that sense of defeat culminated in his famous moment of submission to theism in 1929. The description in his memoir, Surprised by Joy, is unforgettable because of the sheer sense of obligation it conveys.
Tell us about that moment.
He was alone in his room at Magdalen College, feeling what he called the steady, unrelenting approach of him whom I so earnestly desired not to meet. He recounts literally sitting down and giving in, admitting that God was God, and that's why he immediately labeled himself, perhaps that night, the most dejected and reluctant convert in all England.
He felt cornered by logic, not uplifted by spiritual ecstasy.
Exactly. It was a surrender to the idea that the universe, as he intellectually examined it, demanded a theistic explanation, even if his emotional and personal preferences recoiled from the implications.
That intellectual surrender then deepened into full Christianity 2 years later in 1931, after that famous long discussion with Tolkien and Hugo Dyson while they were walking along Addison's Walk in Oxford.
This walk was essentially the final bridge. Tolkien argued that the Christian story was the truest of all the world's myths, and Lewis was convinced. He chose to convert to Anglicanism, becoming an ordinary layman of the Church of England.
We should probably pause here and acknowledge the slight friction that caused. Tolkien was a devout Catholic. Was he happy with Lewis's choice?
Not entirely, no. Tolkien had hoped Lewis would choose the Catholic Church, given the intellectual journey they had shared. The sources note Tolkien was disappointed. However, Lewis remained committed to promoting an ecumenical, non-sectarian core belief system, what he termed mere Christianity.
He seemed to find the actual church experience secondary to the core doctrine, noting that he had initially been repelled by the poor quality of the hymns and the sermons.
Yes, but his view matured. He later expressed that he felt honored to worship alongside men of simple, profound faith men who came in shabby clothes and work boots and sang all the verses to all the hymns. It solidified his belief that the doctrine mattered most, not the denominational trappings.
That mature faith, built on intellectual resistance, leads us directly into his professional life in Section 3, the scholar and the inklings. He truly lived a dual life of rigorous academia and immense creative output.
He absolutely did. His academic career spanned nearly 4 decades in 2 of the world's most prestigious institutions. He spent 29 years as a fellow at Magdalen College, Oxford, from 1925 to 1954. And then he made the unusual move to Cambridge, accepting the newly founded chair in medieval and Renaissance literature at Magdalen College, Cambridge, from 1954 until his death in 1963.
That's a rare feat, holding tenured positions at both Oxford and Cambridge. And his academic work wasn't just safe scholarship, it was often provocative, wasn't it?
Highly provocative, especially given his focus on the later Middle Ages. His most famous scholarly argument was the assertion that there was no such thing as an English Renaissance.
That sounds like heresy in academic circles. What was his core thesis there?
He was arguing against the notion of a dramatic, revolutionary break between the medieval period and the Elizabethan era. Lewis argued for continuity. He contended that the real break in Western thought came later, around the 17th century. By claiming no English Renaissance, he was forcing scholars to view the so-called Renaissance period as merely the final brilliant flowering of the Middle Ages, not some radical new beginning.
That reframing must have had a massive impact on literary studies. What were his key academic publications that still hold weight today?
The Allegory of Love, published in 1936, is foundational. It practically reinvigorated the entire academic study of late medieval narratives, like the Romance of the Rose, by explaining the complexities of courtly love poetry. His book, A Preface to Paradise Lost, remains highly cited in Milton studies, essentially defining how we approach that epic poem.
And his final posthumous work, The Discarded Image, speaks directly to his view of medieval continuity.
It's a foundational text for understanding Lewis's perspective. The Discarded Image is a summary of the unified, structured, pre-Copernican cosmos, the medieval worldview. Lewis felt modern readers couldn't truly understand pre-modern literature without first grasping the structured, ordered universe, which he referred to as the discarded image.
He was arguing that to appreciate Chaucer or Dante, you needed to know exactly what they thought the universe looked like. That structured, orderly universe where everything had its place and was governed by natural law must have appealed hugely to the logical convert we discussed earlier.
It did. It provided the conceptual scaffolding for his later apologetics, the belief in a cosmos that was structured, knowable, and ultimately governed by a rational force. And this intellectual energy found its most fertile ground not in formal lectures, but in an informal literary society. The Inklings. The Inklings, the famed group that gathered at the Eagle and Child pub in Oxford. When did this begin? It began around December 1929, right when Lewis was making his initial conversion to theism. And it wasn't a formal club with dues or anything. It was an informal discussion society, a group of friends who met primarily to read and critique their works in progress. It was a crucial feedback loop for their creativity.
And who were the most notable members, besides Jack and his brother Warnie?
Crucially, J.R. Tolkien, of course, but also Charles Williams, who was a novelist, poet, and theologian who joined later, Neville Coghill, and Owen Barfield. These men were all highly intellectual, deeply literate, and mostly Christian, though their personalities and approaches varied wildly.
We have to stress the significance of the Tolkien friendship within this group. Lewis noted that meeting Tolkien helped him overcome two major prejudices he held. What were those?
Lewis had been warned, he wrote, never to trust a papist and never to trust a philologist. Tolkien, of course, was a devout, traditional Catholic papist and a respected academic of language, philologist. Lewis felt that Tolkien was the person who finally broke down those two irrational barriers, which, again, shows the influence of his Ulster Protestant upbringing finally giving way to genuine, open friendship.
It sounds like an electric environment, a space where they could risk their most outlandish ideas. It's often said that they read portions of The Lord of the Rings and the Chronicles of Narnia to each other for feedback.
That's exactly right. They were each other's earliest and toughest critics. Beyond his peers, Lewis also had a massive impact on his tutorial students during his decades as a fellow.
And we know his personality drew strong reactions. The sources highlight an interesting contradiction in his students.
He tutored the poet John Betjeman and the theater critic Kenneth Tynan. And here's the surprise. The socially and politically conservative Betjeman actively detested Lewis, while the aggressively anti-establishment Tynan retained a lifelong admiration for him.
That's fascinating.
It is. Lewis's appeal was clearly independent of political or social orientation. It was based purely on the force of his intellect and his style of communication.
That style of communication expanded dramatically during World War II, transforming him from an academic into a true public voice.
His role during the war is critical. When the war began, Lewis, being 40, tried to re-enter military service but was rejected. He was then approached by the recruiting office to write columns for the Ministry of Information.
But he flatly rejected that offer. Why?
The sources are very clear on this. He did not want to write lies to deceive the enemy. He felt it was intellectually and morally compromising, regardless of the wartime necessity. He preferred to serve locally in the Home Guard instead. His fierce independence and devotion to truth, even in wartime, dictated his actions.
So he wasn't interested in propaganda, but he ended up delivering something arguably more influential: religious broadcasts on the BBC between 1941 and 1943.
And these broadcasts were delivered from London, often while the city was under periodic air raids. The immediacy, coupled with the crisis of the war, gave his words extraordinary weight. They brought him massive, wide acclaim and were eventually anthologized into his defining work, Mere Christianity.
Air Chief Marshal Sir Donald Hardman described Lewis as providing the key to the meaning of the universe that people desperately needed during that existential crisis. That's a huge claim for a radio program.
It is, and it speaks to the fact that Lewis didn't talk down to his audience. He didn't preach emotionalism. He offered logic and order in a time of chaos. This was not without controversy, though.
Right. The sources note the youthful Alistair Cooke described his appeal as the alarming vogue of Mr. C.S. Lewis, suggesting the wartime environment tended to spawn so many quack religions and messiahs.
It just highlights that even at the height of his influence, his popularity was met with skepticism from those wary of intellectual trends and wartime emotionalism. But Lewis, ever independent, was fiercely determined to avoid the taint of politics.
That determination led him to decline a very high honor from the king, didn't it?
In 1951, George VI offered him a Commander of the Order of the British Empire, a CBE. Lewis declined it, specifically to avoid any perception of political association or the endorsement of any specific government or political viewpoint. He guarded his status as an independent lay theologian fiercely.
His independence and imagination bring us to Section 4. Lewis the Novelist, the segment where he leveraged his scholarship and his faith into some of the most enduring fiction of the last century. We start with his philosophical science fiction, the Ransom trilogy.
Lewis wrote this trilogy specifically to challenge what he saw as dehumanizing trends in contemporary science fiction. He felt that many sci-fi authors were portraying humanity as merely biological matter and the universe as cold, empty space. A materialist narrative he found philosophically bankrupt.
And this started with a conversation with Tolkien, right? A kind of creative dare.
A creative pact, really. They agreed that Lewis would tackle a space travel story, while Tolkien would attempt a parallel time travel story, which was titled The Lost Road, but which Tolkien famously never finished. Lewis, however, delivered his 3 books.
The protagonist, Elwyn Ransom, is actually based in part on Tolkien himself. The trilogy begins with Out of the Silent Planet, where Ransom is kidnapped and taken to Mars, called Malacandra. The central premise is that Earth is the silent planet, cut off from the rest of the cosmos and under the dominion of dark forces.
Then you move into Paralandra, which is essentially a spiritual successor to the Garden of Eden story, but set on Venus. This is where Lewis really gets to play with theology.
So Ransom goes to Venus, which is this new world, fresh out of creation, with its own Adam and Eve, and a new tempter, a new serpent figure. What does Ransom do in this scenario?
Ransom intervenes. He is there to prevent a new fall of man. It's Lewis's thought experiment. What if creation's first couple had resisted temptation? It provides an imaginary scenario of agency, showing that the human will, or the will of a moral agent, is capable of resisting evil, which ties directly into Lewis's later arguments about free will and morality.
The final book, That Hideous Strength, shifts back to Earth, dealing with a sinister, technologically obsessed organization threatening human nature and traditional values near a small English university town.
This is a crucial philosophical link. That Hideous Strength is fictionally exploring the ideas that Lewis would formalize in his most important nonfiction work outside of apologetics, the abolition of man.
Okay, let's pull that thread. How does the fiction illustrate the philosophy?
In That Hideous Strength, the organization, the NICE, seeks to use science and technology to gain total control over human life, fundamentally denying objective value, moral law, and even human nature itself. They treat human beings as raw material to be engineered.
And the abolition of man is Lewis's philosophical defense against that very idea, that if we deny objective value, or what he calls the Tao, we end up destroying humanity.
Precisely. Lewis argues that denying objective value in the pursuit of pure, unguided technological progress, or subjective moral relativism, leads to the end of man as a valuing being. The villains in That Hideous Strength are literally the people who have succeeded in abolishing man. It's a powerful example of Lewis using narrative to provide a warning about the philosophical consequences of denying the natural law.
The greatest success of his fiction, however, remains the Chronicles of Narnia. These 7 books have sold over 100 million copies worldwide.
They are undisputed classics of children's fantasy, inspired in part by the immense rolling beauty of the mountains of Mourne in Northern Ireland. Lewis wrote that certain landscapes there made him feel that at any moment a giant might raise his head over the next ridge. The scale and mythological potential were palpable.
The series draws not only on Christian themes, but also incorporates elements from Greek and Roman mythology fauns and dryads, alongside British and Irish fairy tales. But the nature of the Christian elements is a constant source of debate. Was it an allegory?
Lewis, the expert on allegory, who literally wrote the book on the subject, The Allegory of Love, was crystal clear. The Chronicles were not allegory. He insisted on the term suppositional.
Why is that distinction so critical to understanding Narnia?
Allegory to Lewis is when abstract ideas are dressed up as characters, like gluttony being a fat man. Supposition, however, is asking a hypothetical question. He explained that Aslan, the great lion, is not an allegorical stand-in for Christ. Instead, Aslan is an invention giving an imaginary answer to the question, what might Christ become like if there really were a world like Narnia and he chose to be incarnate and die and rise again in that world as he actually has done in ours?
So it's not a code to be cracked. It's a parallel world demonstrating the same cosmic principles. But even with that clarification, the books attract sharp, sustained criticism.
The most high-profile criticism comes from Philip Pullman, the atheist author of his Dark Materials. Pullman sharply criticized Lewis, accusing the books of being religious propaganda, misogynistic, racist, and even emotionally sadistic.
Those are heavy accusations. What specifically did Pullman object to in the books?
Pullman focused on elements like Susan Pevensey's eventual exclusion from Narnia, which he viewed as misogynistic. She was too interested in nylons, lipstick, and boys to remain committed to Narnia. He also criticized the portrayal of the Kellermans, the dark-skinned, turban-wearing antagonists, which he labeled as racially problematic.
It's a crucial counterpoint to the traditional view of Narnia. Yet, the sources also note Pullman gave Lewis a backhanded compliment, saying the Chronicles of Narnia was a more serious work of literature when compared to Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, which he called trivial.
Even Lewis's critics acknowledged the deep philosophical and moral seriousness behind the fantasy. Beyond the grand epics, Lewis wrote other pivotal fiction, particularly using the novella form for religious fantasy.
The Screwtape Letters, dedicated to Tolkien, remains a masterclass in inverted morality.
It's structured as a series of letters from a senior administrative demon named Screwtape to his bumbling nephew, Wormwood, who was tasked with tempting a specific human patient. It allowed Lewis to explore sin, human folly, and temptation, not from a high moral vantage point, but from the perspective of hell's cynical management team.
The bureaucracy of evil. And then there's The Great Divorce. That book hinges entirely on the concept of choice, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The novella describes a journey where residents of hell take a bus ride to the periphery of heaven. They're met by spiritual guides and given a simple choice. They can stay, and by staying, they can eventually call the place they came from purgatory instead of hell. But almost all of them find heaven simply unbearable. It's too real, too solid, too demanding, and they choose to return to their dreary, subjective hell.
And the title itself was a direct philosophical challenge to another famous writer.
Yes. Lewis called his book The Great Divorce as a direct rebuttal to William Blake's The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. Lewis believed Blake's idea of synthesizing good and evil was a disastrous error, arguing instead for a profound, definitive, and eternal separation between light and shadow.
Finally, we should mention Until We Have Faces. Lewis himself considered this his finest work, yet it remains relatively obscure compared to Narnia.
He called it his most mature and masterly work. It's powerful retelling of the classical myth of Cupid and Psyche, told from the perspective of Psyche's older, jealous sister. Its themes are deeply concerned with religious doubt, the jealousy of the gods, and faith, all set within an entirely pagan framework. It demonstrates Lewis's deep belief that myth itself is a powerful carrier of truth.
That belief in truth conveyed through story and logic is what established him as the apostle to the skeptics, which brings us to Section 5, the Apologist, Reason and Morality.
The influence of Lewis's apologetic works is just immense. Mere Christianity was anthologized from those wartime BBC talks and was voted the best book of the 20th century by Christianity Today in 2000. He earned that nickname because his approach was rational and evidence-based, speaking directly to those who doubted on intellectual grounds.
His works, like The Problem of Pain and Miracles, were designed specifically to take on the tough questions, like the problem of evil we discussed earlier.
He always approached faith as a former skeptic who had been intellectually convinced. He never relied on emotional testimony. He was fighting the atheist with the atheist's own weapons, logic and reason.
That intellectual sparring was famously put to the test in 1948 when Lewis had a public debate with the Christian philosopher Elizabeth Anscombe regarding his book Miracles.
The sources confirm this debate occurred, and Lewis scholar Victor Reppert later pointed out that Anscombe's specific criticisms were challenging enough that Lewis actually revised Miracles for a second edition in 1960 to address her points directly.
But wasn't there a widely circulated account that Lewis was so demoralized by the debate that he stopped writing apologetics?
That narrative, while common, is largely unsupported. Anscombe herself had a different recollection of the emotional effect on Lewis, suggesting he took the defeat in good stride. And what's more, Lewis did continue to publish rigorous apologetic works after 1948, including that revised edition of Miracles. It was an intellectual setback, maybe, but certainly not a career-ending one.
Let's discuss the core piece of Lewisian logic that defines his apologetics. The trilemma argument, laid out in Mere Christianity. He challenges the idea that Jesus was merely a great moral teacher.
Lewis argues that this is an intellectual impossibility. Jesus made explicit claims to divinity, and if a mere man makes claims to be God, those claims demand a logical response. Lewis sought to force the reader to confront those claims honestly.
So, if Jesus was just a good person, why did Lewis say that position is insufficient and even intellectually dishonest?
Because a good moral teacher does not walk around saying, "I am God," or "Before Abraham was, I am." If a man said these things, he could not simultaneously be merely wise or merely good. Lewis forces the choice by stating that the person making those claims must be either.
The famous choice, Lord Lunatic or liar.
Exactly. Lewis puts it starkly. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. The argument is designed to eliminate the comfortable middle ground. He concludes that Jesus himself has not left that open to us. He did not intend to.
The genius here is that he uses the same logical device in his fiction, like when the Pevensey children approach the old professor, Diggory Kirke, in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
Yes. Lucy claims she found a magical land. The professor tells the older children that they must choose between only 3 possibilities. Their sister is lying, she is mad, or she's telling the truth. It's the trilemma repackaged for children, a perfect literary device for clarifying a complex choice by eliminating all the fuzzy possibilities.
Now, despite its popularity in lay apologetics, the sources are clear that the trilemma has significant critics in the academic world.
That's right. It is largely ignored by professional theologians and biblical scholars because of its simplification. The philosopher John Bevis Lewis labeled it a false dilemma and logically unsound.
Why do scholars call it a false dilemma?
They argue that Lewis omitted a fourth, historically plausible possibility, that Jesus' claims were misrepresented or embellished by his followers. Lewis assumes the gospel accounts are perfectly reliable. Critics also suggest that the argument strips Jesus of his Jewish context.
And we have the specific criticism from the Anglican New Testament scholar N.T. Wright regarding that context.
Wright argues that Lewis short-circuited the argument by failing to recognize the specific significance of Jesus' Jewish identity and setting. Within that Jewish context, Jesus' claims were more nuanced than simply shouting, "I am God."
Right.
Wright contends that Lewis's simplification, at best, drastically short-circuits the argument and leaves it vulnerable to historical criticism.
But even if the trilemma is viewed as a brilliant rhetorical tool rather than an airtight philosophical proof, Lewis's fundamental argument for the existence of God remains his appeal to universal morality, or what he called natural law.
This is perhaps his most powerful and subtle argument. The core thesis is that there is a common, innate standard of behavior known universally throughout humanity. We can call it the moral law, the Tao, or natural law.
And what does Lewis derive from this universal knowledge?
He derives two key observations. First, people universally know this law. Second, people universally break it. For Lewis, this dual observation universal knowledge combined with universal failure is the foundation for all clear thinking about ourselves and the universe. We are wired to know right from wrong, yet constantly fail to live up to that knowledge.
And he wove this into Narnia, too, referring to it as the deep magic and the lion, the witch, and the wardrobe, a law so fundamental that even Aslan himself must abide by it.
It's the moral structure of reality. Lewis had to address the common objection that morality is simply a social convention, something invented by humans, like traffic laws.
How does he refute that idea?
His counterargument is razor sharp. If morality were merely convention, Lewis says, we wouldn't be entitled to complain that one moral code is better than another. The very act of criticizing an oppressive society's moral code, for instance, saying Nazi morality was worse than Western democracy's morality, implies that an objective, real morality exists outside of both for comparison. We're not just comparing two subjective tastes, we're appealing to a higher, objective standard.
That's the core of his logic. You can't improve a road if you don't have an objective destination or direction to aim for.
Exactly. And Lewis drives this point home with his famous analogy regarding the execution of witches. This example perfectly illustrates the difference between a change in morality and a change in fact.
Explain that distinction for us because it's so often misunderstood.
Lewis notes that people once executed witches in England. We don't execute them now. Why? Because we became morally better, or because we changed our mind about facts. Lewis argues the latter. He says we ceased execution because our belief about facts changed. We no longer believe witches exist.
So the moral principle that a person who sells their soul to the devil to gain supernatural powers to harm their neighbors deserves the death penalty, that principle hasn't changed.
Correct. The moral principle, punishing treason and malice against the community, remains constant. The factual premise, the existence of witches, changed. Lewis says he wouldn't call a man humane for ceasing to set mousetraps if he did so, because he believed there were no mice in the house. The moral principle toward mice didn't change. The belief about the facts changed. It's a precise, logical way of separating what we believe to be right from what we know to be true about the universe.
That razor-sharp logic brings us full circle, tracing Lewis from his early childhood to his towering academic and public career. Now we arrive at the final, intensely personal chapter in his life, love, loss, and lasting legacy in Section 6.
Lewis was 58 when he married the American writer Joy Davidman Gresham. Their relationship is one of the most compelling love stories in 20th century literature. Joy was an intellectual firebrand in her own right, a Jewish convert to atheism who later converted to Christianity, and a former member of the Communist Party USA.
She came to England with her two sons after separating from her alcoholic husband, and their relationship began as an intellectual kinship through correspondence.
His brother, Warnie, observed that Joy was the only woman Lewis had ever met who had a brain that matched his own in suppleness, in width of interest, and in analytical grasp. She was his true intellectual equal.
They initially entered a civil marriage in 1956 so that she could remain in Britain as she faced deportation. It was a practical arrangement.
But the relationship deepened profoundly after she was diagnosed with terminal bone cancer. It was facing this imminent loss that transformed their kinship into deep spiritual love. They sought a Christian marriage, which was complicated by Joy's previous divorce.
However, a friend, the Reverend Peter Bide, performed a Christian ceremony at her hospital bedside in 1957. And in a remarkable moment, her cancer went into remission, granting them a few precious, unexpected years together as a family.
Lewis later poured his profound love and reverence for her into a quote that defines their multifaceted bond. She was my daughter and my mother, my pupil and my teacher, my subject and my sovereign. And always, holding all these in solution, my trusty comrade, friend, shipmate, fellow soldier.
That quote encompasses every facet of their bond, the intellectual, the parental, the emotional, and the shared journey. It's such an expression of complex emotional vulnerability, especially for a man who had been so guarded since the loss of his mother and the trauma of the war.
It demonstrates that his love for Joy finally broke down the protective walls that had characterized Lewis's early life. Tragically, the remission was temporary, and Joy died in 1960.
Lewis processed his devastating grief in the book A Grief Observed. This work is known for its brutal, raw honesty, documenting the chaotic nature of loss, the questioning of God, and the sudden feeling of faithlessness.
It was so intensely personal that he initially published it under the pseudonym N.W. Clerk to protect his privacy. The irony, as the sources note, is that many friends, unaware he was the author, recommended the book to Lewis himself as a spiritual guide for dealing with his specific type of loss.
Lewis adopted Joy's two sons, David and Douglas Gresham, and continued to raise them. Their paths, too, diverged significantly, showing the complexity of Lewis's blended family.
Douglas Gresham remained Christian, deeply committed to Lewis's faith. David, however, converted to his mother's ancestral faith, becoming Orthodox Jewish. The sources also mention a later tragic detail revealed by Douglas in 2020. David had been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia in his youth and died in 2014 in a Swiss mental hospital. It highlights the sustained familial difficulty and loyalty that continued beyond Joy's death.
Lewis's own health began to fail soon after. Starting in 1961, he suffered from recurrent nephritis, which progressed to chronic low-grade sepsis and eventual kidney failure.
He had a heart attack in July 1963, and though he recovered briefly, he was too ill to return to his position, resigning his prestigious Cambridge chair that August.
He died of end-stage kidney failure at his home, the Kilns, on 22 November 1963 at age 64. And here we hit the astonishing historical coincidence.
A convergence of literary and political history. Lewis's death occurred on the exact same day as the assassination of U.S. President John F. Kennedy, and also the death of fellow literary giant Aldous Huxley, the author of Brave New World.
That triple punch of famous deaths on November 20, 1963 inspired Peter Kreeft's famous philosophical dialogue between heaven and hell, imagining all three meeting posthumously. Lewis's passing was completely eclipsed by the magnitude of the news from Dallas, yet his legacy has only grown in the decades since.
Absolutely. In 2013, on the 50th anniversary of his death, he was honored with a memorial in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey, joining the pantheon of Britain's greatest writers.
And the inscribed quote summarizes the power of his conversion experience and his integrated worldview, doesn't it?
It does. It's taken from one of his addresses. I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. It encapsulates his philosophy. Faith provides the light by which the rest of the universe becomes intelligible.
We see that legacy reflected in numerous modern adaptations, from the 1993 feature film Shadowlands, which dramatized his life and loss with Joy David Hellman, to the recent 2021 biographical drama, The Most Reluctant Convert, which focused precisely on the journey we explored today, from atheist fury to intellectual submission.
And you can find a physical tribute in his homeland, a bronze statue of his Narnian character, Diggory Kirk, the boy who finds the entrance to Narnia in The Magician's Nephew, standing proudly in East Belfast, close to Lewis's childhood home.
Lewis, or Jack, managed to synthesize intellectual rigor as the scholar, imaginative world-building as the novelist, and profound conviction as the apologist. His immense body of work, born from trauma and fierce intellectual honesty, allows you, the listener, to shortcut the complexities of faith, human nature, and literary history by using compelling story and razor-sharp logic, whether you ultimately agree with his conclusions or not.
That synthesis, that ability to connect the objective truth he found in scholarship with the imaginative truths he found in myth, is his enduring strength. And to leave you with a provocative thought, Lewis, who so actively eschewed political involvement and public honor, dedicated his book The Abolition of Man to defending the concept of objective value and natural law. He argued it was a necessary basis for the very idea of a rule which is not tyranny or an obedience which is not slavery. End quote. If, as Lewis suggested, objective truth is the only reliable defense against tyranny, what are the immediate consequences for a modern society that views morality primarily as a social convention to be changed or discarded by consensus?
Something profound to mull over until our next deep dive.